Good morning, I'm Deb Watson, and here's a free watercolor tutorial with helpful tips to improve your landscapes. First, draw or trace the outline. To paint great landscapes, start with the area farthest away and work your way forward. So wet the paper down to the tree lines with clean water, going over all the sky and distant mountains. I like to dump on the water, a lot of water, and then turn the paper so I can see if I've missed any bits. When the paper starts dripping, it's a good dampness. This is cerulean blue. Now for a fresh-looking sky, lay the color on and leave it alone as much as you can. I know it's hard not to fuss with it, but the less you do, the better your sky will be. The distant mountains are blue-gray. Mix the gray by adding just a little orange or brown to your blue. If your paper is still wet, you can let it dry, or you can dab it with a paper towel to dry. You want the distant mountains to be about the same value as your sky. If they seem too dark, use a thirsty brush, that's a brush with most of the water wiped out, to lift up some of the color while it's still wet. Wipe the color off and wipe it on a paper towel. Next, start with the most distant tree mass. Now, keep your green very subdued. You don't want a bright green. I'm making a kind of green with my blue, gray, and yellow. I know this is not very green, but it does help it recede into the background. It's better to have the distant greens be too gray than too green, because it's easy to use leftover green at the end of this landscape to brighten them up if you want to. Start at the bottom and pull the color up for soft edges. The right side tree mass is a little closer to the viewer, so it should be a little darker than the farther away trees, but you don't want it too dark. And while you still have some of that tree color left, wet the water under the trees, leaving a line of unpainted paper between the wet paper and the trees. And then touch in some of your leftover tree color and let it spread on the wet paper. This makes a great reflection. And I'm out of paint. So I'll try to mix up something that matches well enough for the reflection on the right side. When your reflections are in, dry it very well. Next, we're going to skip to the boat so we can get the boat reflection in before we paint the water. The boat can be any color you like, but my boat will match the reference photo. So I mixed up a puddle of dark brown, some beige, and to make it even darker, I'll probably add a little blue. The boat is the center of interest for this landscape. So use a brush with a sharp point so you can paint the small spaces precisely. If you have trouble with this, you can combine pen and ink or colored pencil for the boat, and that might be easier. The reflection is the same color as the boat with jagged lines. The left side of the boat and the reflection are both a little bit darker brown. And I like to add a darker line at the water line and maybe under the top railing. Finally, it's time for the water. Mix a big puddle of light blue and a small puddle of dark blue. Wet the water going right over top of the reflections, but going around the boat and the foreground. I like to use a big wash brush for most of the water, but I switch to a small brush for that precise edges close to the boat. Paint your water with a small brush. You want to leave an area of white at the back and then start with a little light blue under that. At the end, you want the water to be lighter at the top and darker at the bottom near the foreground. But you can go back and forth as many times as you want to get a smooth blend. When you come to the foreground, try to make it grassy edge instead of a straight one. It'll look more believable in your landscape. And once again with your water, you can use a thirsty brush to lift out ripples. Then dry this very well. The foreground is going to be a bright yellow-green. You can mix this with your blue and yellow, and when you paint it, try for a little variety so that it has a texture-like look. As you paint towards the right side, you're going to want the right side to be a little bit darker. So you can darken your green with the dark blue. There's a great green called Parylene green, which is great for darkening. Use the same dark green to suggest a leafy tree on the right. You could sponge this tree or paint it with your brush, but either way, leave holes for the birds to fly through. See how the more saturated green of the tree comes forward in front of the subdued looking green masses in the back? The trunk of the tree can be the same green, and you can use some of the darker green to make your shadow on the foreground even darker. Oops, I got a spot in my sky. Well, that can become a bird. Let's put in a flock of birds. For the finishing detail on your boat, you can use white to add a rope going to a buoy. Since every painting needs a little red, I'm going to add a red buoy with a red reflection and a tiny white highlight. Here's the landscape. Remember, your painting doesn't need to look like mine to be successful. Every landscape will be a little different. And that's not only okay, that's the fun part. Visit Watson Watercolor for the full free lesson, and happy painting!